These aren't just bad cars. They're industrial disasters, rolling embarrassments, and proof that automakers sometimes just gave up. These 8 machines were so awful, so shockingly incompetent, that it's a miracle anyone survived owning them.
Please support us and subscribe to the channel. Thank you.
Number 8. 1984 Chrysler Laser. The high-tech sports car that was really just a K car in sunglasses. When Chrysler unveiled the 1984 Laser, the company wanted the world to believe it had created a sleek, advanced, futuristic sports coupe, a digital-age performance machine designed to compete with the Mustang, Camaro, and even imported turbocharged rivals. The ads were bold. The brochures screamed high-tech. Chrysler slapped digital dashboards, futuristic graphics, turbo badges, and angular bodywork on it. On paper, the Laser sounded like Chrysler's leap into the sports car renaissance of the 1980s. But peel off that shiny marketing layer, and the truth shows itself clearly. The 1984 Chrysler Laser was a K car in a Halloween costume, wearing sporty clothes it didn't earn, and sporting equipment it couldn't reliably sustain. Underneath the sweeping glass hatch and wedge-shaped body lived the same front-wheel drive K-car architecture that supported sedans, wagons, and minivans. It was more family appliance than performance machine, more suburban commuter than backroad warrior. The biggest lie told by the Laser was its performance persona. Yes, Chrysler offered a turbocharged 2.2-liter four-cylinder. And yes, on a good day, with perfect weather, clean injectors, and an owner who hadn't offended the automotive gods, it could produce respectable torque. But reliability? That was a different matter entirely. The turbocharger was infamous for premature failures. Oil seals leaked, bearings wore out, and the units cooked themselves under heat they could barely manage. Owning a turbo Laser often meant bracing for a sudden whistling sound, a cloud of smoke, and a wallet that was about to lose weight quickly. Even in its high output form, the Laser struggled to convince anyone it was a real sports car. Acceleration was inconsistent, and turbo lag was significant. The powertrain felt like it was constantly apologizing, trying to catch its breath. And once the boost arrived, assuming the turbo was in the mood to cooperate, torque steer yanked the steering wheel like the car was fighting an invisible opponent. Handling was equally disappointing. Despite the sporty marketing, the Laser rode on suspension geometry and components designed for comfort and low-cost manufacturing. Body roll was noticeable, steering feedback was vague, and the car lacked the precision needed to justify its sports coupe label. The Laser didn't carve corners, it survived them. You could feel the K-car DNA in every turn, every bump, every emergency maneuver. The car wasn't bad in the way some 70s land barges were bad. Instead, it was mediocre, trying desperately to pretend it was exciting. The interior tried to compensate with an overdose of 1980s futurism. Chrysler gave the Laser digital gauges, electronic readouts, touchy trip computers, and the light-up theme that felt straight out of an arcade cabinet. The dashboards looked cutting edge at first, until you realized they were fragile, glitchy, and prone to electrical gremlins. Owners often found themselves staring at dead pixels, flickering readouts, or entire instrument clusters that decided to take the day off. Chrysler's attempt at high-tech luxury didn't help the driving experience either. The seats were soft and flat, more like living room furniture than sports car buckets. The ergonomics were hit or miss, and the interior plastics were thin, shiny, and eager to fade or crack under sunlight. For a car sold as futuristic, the Laser aged rapidly, both mechanically and aesthetically. As for build quality, well, it was 1980s Chrysler. Panel gaps looked like they were measured with a ruler made of spaghetti. Trim pieces loosened, rattles appeared early in ownership, air leaks introduced unexpected whistling at highway speeds. It wasn't that the Laser was hopeless, it simply wasn't built to compete in the arena it was marketed for. Chrysler's ambitions exceeded its resources, and the Laser became another example of trying to dress up basic mechanical ingredients as something far more exotic. Despite its flaws, the Laser wasn't hated, it was simply forgotten. The car didn't create scandals or explosive failures, it didn't deliver world-beating performance. It was just fine. Fine in a way that didn't stick in the memory. And that's the Laser's biggest legacy. It promised excitement and innovation, but delivered warmed-over familiarity under a futuristic shell. The people who bought them didn't necessarily regret the purchase, but they didn't tell their friends about it either. Ultimately, the 1984 Chrysler Laser is a lesson in marketing over mechanics. It shows what happens when a company tries to create a sports car without actually building one. The Laser wanted to be high-tech, but its electronics were flaky. It wanted to be fast, but its turbocharger was unreliable. It wanted to be sporty, but its chassis was a budget commuter platform. It wanted to be futuristic, but it aged faster than nearly all of its rivals. Today, the Laser is a footnote, a curiosity from the era when American automakers still believed they could slap a turbo, a digital dash, and a glossy ad campaign on a basic platform and call it innovation. It was a K-car in a shiny jacket, a poser among performance cars, and the reminder that technology and styling cannot mask structural limitations. In the end, the 1984 Chrysler Laser wasn't a high-tech sports car. It was a well-dressed reminder that true performance requires more than marketing buzzwords, glowing dashboards, and fragile turbochargers.
Number 7. 1975 Chevrolet Chevelle Malibu, the muscle car legend that became a wheezing commuter blob. By the time 1975 rolled around, the Chevrolet Chevelle, once a proud, snarling symbol of American muscle, had fallen so far from glory that even its own fans barely recognized it. The name Malibu had once belonged to a trim level that evoked sun, fun, and performance style. But in 1975, GM effectively turned it into the corporate version of a sigh. Heavy, slow, and depressingly dull. This car wasn't the descendant of the Chevelle SS396. It was the descendant of bean counter paranoia, emissions regulations, and weight gain tragedy. The 1975 Chevrolet Chevelle Malibu arrived at exactly the wrong moment in American automotive history. Emissions controls strangled horsepower. Insurance companies crushed high-performance models. Fuel economy mandates loomed large, and GM responded with an approach that could be best described as, just give them something to move. The product of that approach was a 1975 Malibu, a large, mushy, underpowered commuter car wearing the ghost of a once legendary nameplate. A heavy, wheezing shell of its former self. Start with the weight. The 1975 Malibu was obese by mid-size standards of the era, a result of reinforced bumpers, thick body panels, and GM's habit of over-engineering the wrong parts. The car felt overweight even when parked. Once in motion, the bolt became undeniable. You didn't accelerate, you gathered momentum. You didn't corner, you leaned, groaned, and prayed. The car's suspension, tuned for comfort above all else, delivered all the agility of wet drywall. The engine options were no help. The base 250 cubic inch inline-six coughed out barely enough horsepower to power a lawn tractor. The small block V8s, battered by emissions components and choked by catalytic converters, performed like they were dragging a piano. These weren't the rumbling beasts of Chevelle SS fame. These were overworked, underpowered engines begging for mercy. Even the optional 350 V8, which was once the go-to solution for effortless torque, now produced horsepower figures that would embarrass a modern compact car. From street threat to commuter appliance. The tragedy of the 75 Chevelle Malibu was not that it was terrible to drive. It was that it was so utterly forgettable. Where earlier Chevelles had personality, aggression, and swagger, this car had none.
It was engineered to offend no one, which meant it inspired no one. The Malibu became a commuter appliance, a beige interpretation of what a mid-size American car should be. Its steering was numb, the brakes were just adequate, the acceleration was described in seconds but felt like minutes. Everything about the car whispered average, acceptable, and don't expect too much. Even the styling had become conservative, boxy, and anonymous. It wasn't ugly, that would have required intention. Instead, it was bland to the point of invisibility. A cabin designed for people who no longer cared about cars. Inside, the 75 Malibu continued its theme of mediocrity. The plastics were uninspired, the gauges looked like an afterthought, as if the designers had almost forgotten the driver needed to see things. The column shifter, bench seats, and vast seas of vinyl reminded everyone that in 1975, car interiors were built more for cleaning convenience than drive-in enjoyment. Yes, the Malibu offered space, but it offered no excitement. It was a car you bought because you needed one, not because you wanted one. The interior didn't resemble a muscle machine or even a sporty family sedan. It resembled a waiting room on wheels, spacious, quiet, and completely devoid of personality. GM sleepwalking through the 1970s. If the earlier Chevelles were the product of GM at the height of its creative powers, the 1975 Malibu was a product of a company sleepwalking. GM knew the name Chevelle meant something to people, but it also knew the performance era was dead, at least temporarily. So the company strapped the Malibu name onto a car engineered from the corporate parts bin. The result was a mid-sized car that didn't stand out, didn't lead the segment, and didn't inspire loyalty. Even Chevrolet's marketing reflected this energy. Advertisements focused on value, fuel economy, and features, not performance, not style, and certainly not excitement. The Chevelle had become a transportation device, not a cultural symbol. How a legend became a blob. The best way to understand the 1975 Chevrolet Chevelle Malibu is to imagine a retired athlete who puts on 70 pounds, stops training, and starts selling insurance. The spirit is gone. The strength is gone. The glory days are fading in the rearview mirror. The Malibu wasn't a bad car. It was just a sad one. A once great performance lineage had been reduced to this heavy, soft, and uninspired commuter car. The Malibu had traded snarls for yawns. And to the gearheads who remembered what a Chevelle should be, the 75 model felt like a betrayal wrapped in sheet metal. The final word. The 1975 Chevrolet Chevelle Malibu stands today as one of the clearest symbols of the muscle car era's downfall. It showed how far a legendary nameplate could fall when regulations, corporate caution, and cost-cutting combined forces. It wasn't fast. It wasn't fun. It wasn't exciting. It was a blob. A wheezing, softened, dull mid-size sedan carrying the ghost of one of America's greatest performance badges. And that is why when enthusiasts talk about Chevelles today, they mention the 64, the 66, the 70, but almost never the 75. Because while the Malibu lived on, the spirit of the Chevelle had long since left the building.
Number 6. 1971 AMC Hornet base model. The cheapest car of 1971, and it showed. The 1971 AMC Hornet base model exists today as one of the clearest examples of what happens when an automaker tries to build a car so cheap, so stripped, and so bare bones that it ends up feeling more like a government procurement item than a personal vehicle. AMC needed a low-priced winner to keep the company alive, but the base Hornet went far beyond affordable and landed squarely in punishment. It was a car built for customers who had no choice, no money, or no standards, and sometimes all three. The Hornet lineup itself wasn't terrible. Higher trims could be decently equipped, moderately stylish, and reasonably comfortable. But the base model, that was AMC's ultimate cost-cutting exercise. If you took a normal compact car of the early 1970s and began removing features one by one, you would eventually end up with the 1971 Hornet base model. It was as if AMC was paid by the pound to remove equipment. A cabin so bare it felt like a taxi cab without a meter. Let's start inside, where the cost cutting was easiest to see and hardest to ignore. The base Hornet's interior had all the warmth and charm of an unfurnished studio apartment. Vinyl seats so cheap they felt like repurposed shower curtains. Hard plastic everywhere, door panels that flexed like cardboard, because frankly they were nearly cardboard. And that's before you got to the features. You didn't get a radio? That was extra. You didn't get a cigarette lighter? Extra. You didn't even get a right side mirror because AMC declared it a luxury. The steering wheel was a thin, two-spoke plastic hoop that looked like it was taken off a child's go-kart. The instrument cluster was brutally simple: speedometer, fuel gauge, and a row of warning lights that glowed like a cheap motel vacancy sign. No temperature gauge, no oil pressure gauge, nothing that might give the driver an actual sense of mechanical security. If AMC could have charged extra for the windshield, they probably would have. Engines that barely counted as engines. Under the hood, things didn't get any more inspiring. The base model came with AMC's 199 cubic inch inline six, an engine that was rugged in theory but hopelessly underpowered in practice. With roughly 125 horsepower dragging around a fully sized compact sedan, the Hornet was slow even by the standards of its own era, a time when 0 to 60 often meant eventually. Acceleration was sluggish, passing power non-existent, and climbing a long hill meant holding your breath and hoping the pistons felt like cooperating. The engine didn't purr, roar, or rumble. It complained loudly. It sounded like someone vacuuming gravel. AMC offered a 3-speed manual transmission as standard, but calling it manual was generous. It felt more like stirring a bucket of bolts with a broom handle. The automatic was smoother, but it drained what little performance the car had left. A ride harsh enough to double as physical therapy. The 1971 Hornet base model rode terribly, even by economy-class standards. The suspension was tuned stiff to save cost and weight, so every bump felt like a personal insult. Potholes? The car didn't absorb them. It cataloged them, amplified them, then delivered them to the driver's spine with scientific precision. Steering was no better. Manual steering wasn't just standard, it was the only option unless you paid up. That meant slow steering response, heavy low-speed turning, and vague feedback everywhere. Parking one felt like wrestling a reluctant farm animal. The car felt agricultural enough that one could reasonably assume AMC sourced the suspension from wheelbarrows and the steering system from leftover tractor parts. Build quality, a gamble every time you closed the door. AMC in the early 70s had good ideas, but not enough money to execute them. The result was build quality that varied wildly. Some Hornets held up decently. Others began falling apart before they hit 30,000 miles. Door seals leaked, interior trim warped, weather stripping peeled off like old tape. The trunk sometimes let rainwater in. Not enough to ruin anything, but enough to remind you that the car didn't particularly care about your belongings. Rust was another perpetual threat. In salty climates, a 1971 Hornet could begin rusting so aggressively it was almost enthusiastic about returning to the earth. The base Hornet's biggest problem? It felt cheap. Many cheap cars are at least charming. The Volkswagen Beetle was slow but lovable. The Datsun 510 was affordable but lively. Even Detroit's own Pinto and Vega tried to feel modern. But the base model Hornet? It didn't feel lovable, lively, or modern. It felt like a cost spreadsheet on wheels, the product of accountants fighting to see who could remove the most features without technically breaking the car. It didn't attract people who wanted a Hornet. It attracted people who needed the cheapest new car they could find, even if it drove like it resented them. A car AMC needed, but buyers didn't want. The Hornet kept AMC alive financially, but the base version wasn't the reason. Higher trims appealed to normal buyers. The base model appealed mostly to fleet managers, government agencies, and extremely budget-limited families. To the average American buyer in 1971, the base Hornet felt outdated, uncomfortable, gutless, and joyless. A car that never should have been driven farther than the grocery store. Conclusion: a car barely above the poverty line. The 1971 AMC Hornet base model stands as one of the stripped, joyless, and bare minimum cars of the decade. It wasn't dangerous, it wasn't innovative, and it wasn't even interesting. It was just cheap, aggressively, unapologetically cheap. For people who only needed 4 wheels and a warranty, it was a tool. For everyone else, it was a reminder that not all budget cars are created equal. Some are simply built to meet the lowest possible price, and the base Hornet was the reference point for that philosophy. It didn't ruin AMC, but it sure didn't win them any new fans.
Number 5. 1976 Dodge Charger Daytona, when a legendary name was glued onto a rolling disappointment. Few names in American automotive history carry the dramatic weight of Daytona. The word instantly conjures up images of high-bank speedways, winged warriors, NASCAR glory, and cars so outrageous they practically bent the laws of physics. The 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona was one of the most iconic, aerodynamic, high-speed monsters Detroit ever unleashed. A car so effective that NASCAR banned it. It was loud, fast, fearless, and built for one thing: domination. And then came the 1976 Dodge Charger Daytona, a vehicle that borrowed that legendary name not to honor it, but to exploit it. It was the automotive equivalent of slapping the word Ferrari on a lawnmower, a car that inherited none of the performance, none of the engineering brilliance, none of the wild ambitions of its predecessor. It was a decal package on a car that had long since surrendered any claim to sportiness. The 1976 Charger Daytona is a masterclass in automotive false advertising, a nameplate misused so spectacularly that owners of the original wing Daytona probably cried into their motor oil. A legendary name put on the wrong car. To understand how the Daytona name became so embarrassingly diluted, you have to understand where the Charger was by 1976. The golden era was over. The muscle car flame had flickered. The Charger had morphed into a snarling performance coupe built on Chrysler's chunky B-body platform. The 1976 Charger was no athlete. It was a disco-era couch on wheels, designed for soft rides, padded vinyl roofs, and chrome trim thick enough to survive a small meteor strike. So what did Dodge do when they needed excitement? They didn't improve horsepower, they didn't lighten the car, they didn't sharpen the handling. Instead, they created the Daytona Decor package, which included gaudy stripes, a rear spoiler that did nothing, bright colors, special badges, and some cosmetic tweaks. And that was it. No real performance upgrades whatsoever. Nothing even remotely related to the heroic wing Daytona of 7 years ago. It was marketing by nostalgia. A car designed to remind people of a legend while delivering none of the legend's substance. Engines that couldn't outrun a lawn tractor. If the 1976 Daytona had one job, it was to move with at least a hint of authority. But under the hood, Dodge offered engines so weak, they made even the Malaise-era Mustang II look ambitious. Standard power came from a 318 cubic inch V8 that wheezed out around 150 horsepower on a good day. Yes, the sporty Daytona was powered by the same engine used in countless fleet cars, trucks, and station wagons. For those who wanted performance, an optional 360 V8 was available. But thanks to emissions controls and low compression, even the 360 couldn't save this overweight cruiser. Its output was mediocre, its response sluggish, and its enthusiasm non-existent. 0 to 60? In the 10 to 12 second range. Quarter mile? Don't ask. Top speed? Let's just say it wasn't setting any records. A car wearing that Daytona name should have been kicking down the gates of NASCAR. Instead, it was trying its hardest to just merge onto the highway. Handling? A car that floated more than it drove. Calling the 1976 Charger Daytona's handling soft is like calling the Pacific Ocean damp. The suspension was tuned for comfort, not control. On the road, this car didn't corner. It swayed like a cruise ship navigating rough waters. Steering feedback was a foreign concept. Turn the wheel and the car would eventually decide to respond, but only after it finished contemplating whether the maneuver was worth it. Body roll? Olympic level. Braking? Bring a calendar. Agility? Comparable to a tranquilized rhino. Any illusion of performance created by the Daytona stripes dissolved the moment the driver attempted even mild-spirited driving. The car simply wasn't built for it. A heavy, bloated personal luxury coupe wearing a racing costume. By 1976, the Charger wasn't competing with Camaros or Firebirds anymore. It was competing with the Monte Carlo, Grand Prix, and Thunderbird. Cushy, plush, barge-like cruisers with long hoods, short decks, opera windows, thick vinyl roofs, and enough fake wood trim to build a small cabin. The Daytona package tried to inject excitement, but the underlying car was fundamentally a boulevard cruiser. It wanted soft jazz, not screaming NASCAR engines. Imagine trying to turn a lazy boy recliner into a racy by adding racing stripes. That's basically the 1976 Charger Daytona. Exterior styling. Flash without fire. Visually, the Daytona package delivered what marketing demanded. Flash. The paint schemes were loud, the stripes dramatic, and the rear spoiler suggestive of speed. At a glance, you might think it was trying to evoke some of the swagger of the original Daytona. But a closer look revealed a vehicle that had none of the aerodynamic genius or engineering purposefulness of its predecessor. The 1976 version was all show and absolutely no go. A car that looked fast only in the same way a Halloween costume looks realistic from far away. A car that misled buyers more than it impressed them. Buyers who expected the resurgence of a legend were greeted instead by a car that drove like a forgettable mid-70s sedan with a nice paint job. For enthusiasts, the disappointment was enormous. For Dodge, the Daytona name was supposed to conjure performance heritage. Instead, it became a reminder of just how far the once mighty Charger had fallen. Worse, the 1976 Daytona felt inauthentic in a way that even other Malaise cars didn't. Many 1970s cars were slow, but at least they were honest about it. The Daytona pretended to be something it wasn't, an unforgivable sin for a performance nameplate. Conclusion: a Daytona in name only. The 1976 Dodge Charger Daytona deserves a place in automotive history, not for excellence, not for innovation, but for being one of the most blatant examples of badge engineering masquerading as performance. It was slow, heavy, unathletic, cosmetically desperate, historically disrespectful, and completely unnecessary. A car that provided none of the speed, none of the glory, and none of the engineering brilliance that the Daytona name deserved. The 1976 Daytona wasn't just a disappointment, it was an embarrassment. A rolling reminder that in the mid-1970s, even legendary names weren't safe from being slapped onto the nearest underpowered barge for a quick marketing boost.
Number 4. 1979 Chrysler Cordoba 318, the luxury poseur with the saddest small block in town. The 1979 Chrysler Cordoba was sold as a glamorous, refined, personal luxury coupe for Americans who wanted a taste of Cadillac-style elegance without paying Cadillac-style prices. In commercials, Ricardo Montalban purred about rich Corinthian leather, with the smooth confidence of a man who truly believed the Cordoba was a masterpiece. The car itself, unfortunately, told a very different story. Beneath the opera windows, padded vinyl, and chrome trinkets sat one of the dreariest powertrains Chrysler ever paired with the supposedly upscale machine, the 318 small block in its late 70s emission-strangled form. If luxury is supposed to feel effortless, powerful, and graceful, the 1979 Cordoba with the 318 was the opposite. Slow to move, thirsty to run, and built with the kind of quality that made owners pray every time they turned the key. It was a stylish tuxedo wrapped around an exhausted, wheezing engine that could barely haul itself down the highway. The 318, a great engine ruined by a bad decade. To be fair to the 318 V8, it wasn't inherently awful. In its earlier forms, it was one of Chrysler's most reliable small blocks, simple, tough, and capable. But by 1979, thanks to federal emissions rules, low compression engineering, and Chrysler being financially half alive, the 318 had become a ghost of its former self. Horsepower hovered around the 130 to 140 HP range, depending on the configuration. That meant that a 3,800-pound luxury coupe moved with the urgency of a tired mule dragging a piano uphill. Press the gas pedal, and the engine didn't roar, it moaned, as if it begged you to reconsider. Acceleration was so slow that passing maneuvers required courage, a long stretch of empty road, and a sincere prayer. The Cordoba 318 wasn't just slow, it was slow in a way that felt fundamentally wrong for a car sold as classy premium transportation. Fuel economy, a wallet-destroying experience. A big luxury coupe with a choked-out V8 isn't just slow, it's also spectacularly inefficient. The 1979 Cordoba's 318 delivered fuel economy numbers that could make even pickup truck owners wince. Real-world mileage often hovered in the 11 to 14 mpg range, sometimes worse if the carburetor wasn't tuned, and many weren't. That meant the Cordoba managed the rare feat of combining sluggish performance with awful fuel economy, the worst of both worlds. Owners didn't drive their cars, they budgeted their trips. The weight problem. Luxury bulk without luxury power. It wasn't just the engine holding the Cordoba back. It was the car's entire physical presence. The 1979 Cordoba was heavy, solid, and substantial, but not in the precision-crafted luxury sense. Instead, it felt like Chrysler had bolted extra mass everywhere they could. Some of that weight came from genuine structure, but much of it came from unnecessary chrome, thick vinyl roofing, sound deadening, heavy doors, and just general late 1970s Detroit over-engineering. The result was a car that moved like a bowling ball on a wet carpet, slow to start, slow to stop, and not particularly good at changing direction. Handling. More of a gentle drift than a drive. If the Cordoba had at least handled gracefully, some of its shortcomings might have been forgiven. Instead, it handled exactly as you'd expect a late 1970s Chrysler coupe to handle. Soft, vague, and disconnected from reality. The suspension was tuned for a luxury ride, which in practice meant lots of body roll, lots of floating, and steering that felt like stirring a bucket of pudding. You didn't guide the Cordoba through curves, you negotiated with it. And most of the time, it disagreed. Build quality. When Chrysler was barely keeping the lights on. The late 1970s weren't kind to Chrysler. The company was circling the financial drain, scraping together survival money, and cutting corners everywhere possible. As a result, 1979 Cordobas were produced in an era when body panels didn't always line up, interior trim was known to fall off,
Carburetors arrived from the factory pre-misadjusted. Electrical systems had the lifespan of a mayfly. Weather stripping sometimes refused to strip the weather. Chrysler was building cars under duress, and it showed. The Cordoba may have looked glamorous under dealership lighting, but it aged quickly and poorly. Rich Corinthian leather couldn't hide cheap plastic underneath. Styling. The one thing Chrysler actually got right. To give credit where it's due, the Cordoba looked good. In fact, it looked great. The long hood, formal roofline, ornamental grille, and opera windows gave it a presence few personal luxury cars could match. It was handsome in a dramatic, theatrical way. A car that absolutely lived for the spotlight. But in 1979, Chrysler leaned too hard on style because it had nothing else to lean on. The car became a perfect symbol of the era. Beautiful on the surface, compromised underneath. It was a Hollywood actor in full costume performing in a low-budget soap opera. Driving experience, a luxury illusion that fell apart on the road. Behind the wheel, the Cordoba delivered an experience that never matched its visual promise. It tried to act upscale, but its slow acceleration, heavy feel, and mushy handling made the illusion crumble quickly. Driving a 1979 Cordoba with the 318 often felt like piloting a tired barge, wrestling an overfed horse, or commanding a couch that refused to obey. Momentum was its only friend. Once it finally got up to speed, it cruised comfortably enough. But getting there was an ordeal, and stopping meant starting the ordeal all over again. Why people remember it fondly, and why they shouldn't. Nostalgia has been suspiciously kind to the 1979 Cordoba. People remember the commercials, the styling, and the sense of affordable luxury. What they conveniently forget is how flawed the car actually was. The lethargic 318, the terrible gas mileage, the shoddy build quality, the floaty handling, the mechanical headaches. The car had personality, yes, but many of its quirks were simply defects dressed in fancy clothing. Conclusion: a luxury car with no luxury where it counted. The 1979 Chrysler Cordoba with the 318 wasn't a terrible car because it failed mechanically. It was terrible because it pretended to be something it wasn't. Its styling promised class, power, and prestige, but the driving experience delivered mediocrity, frustration, and disappointment. The car was stylish but slow, elegant but inefficient, confident on the outside, but uncertain on the inside, luxurious in marketing, but budget grade in engineering. In the end, the car became a perfect symbol of Chrysler's 1970 struggle, a beautiful facade hiding a reality that was falling apart. A luxury coupe powered by the world's saddest small block, the 1979 Chrysler Cordoba remains one of the most memorable pretenders of its era.
Number 3. 1970 Ford Maverick 170 i6. A budget car so weak it made economy feel like punishment. When Ford introduced the 1970 Maverick, the company proudly announced it as the perfect answer to the rising tide of inexpensive imports. They positioned it as a no-nonsense compact, simple, rugged, and affordable. And to be fair, it was affordable. It was also simple. But rugged? Refined? Enjoyable in any way? With the 170 cubic inch inline-six under the hood, the Maverick wasn't so much rugged as it was primitive. A car designed with the minimum number of parts necessary to move, and even that was up for debate. The 1970 Maverick 170 i6 wasn't an economy car because it was clever. It was an economy car because Ford stripped out everything resembling refinement, comfort, power, and joy. It was cheap because it had to be, not because it was efficiently designed. Its only true innovation was figuring out how to make driving feel like a tax. A 105 horsepower engine on a good day.
The 170 i6 was essentially a leftover from the Falcon era, a tiny, underpowered, slow-revving engine that should have been retired by the time man landed on the moon. Instead, Ford stuffed it into their new, modern compact and hoped nobody would notice. With around 105 horsepower, the Maverick 170 wasn't just slow, it was heroically slow. 0 to 60 wasn't a measurement, it was an event. Something you started in the morning with the hope of reaching highway speed before lunch. The engine made noises that suggested effort, but the car itself rarely responded. Press the gas pedal and nothing dramatic happened. The 170 didn't roar, it didn't surge, it didn't even howl. It simply buzzed like an overworked appliance, a kitchen blender trying to chop concrete. Owners joked that their microwaves generated more thrust. And honestly, they weren't wrong. The driving experience: loud, rough, and miserable. Driving a Maverick with the 170 i6 meant accepting that the car would shake, vibrate, rattle, and hum at all speeds. Noise insulation was apparently viewed as optional because Ford included almost none. At highway speeds, the car sounded like a loose toolbox being dragged through a metal warehouse. The cheapness was everywhere. Drumming sheet metal that acted like a built-in noise amplifier, a steering system with the precision of a broken shopping cart, a suspension that transmitted every pebble directly into the driver's skull, thin seats that felt like church folding chairs, door panels that buzzed like angry bees at anything above 35 miles per hour. The Maverick wasn't just unrefined, it felt unfinished, as if engineers forgot to complete several steps before production. Acceleration, a masterclass in patience. The 170 i6 produced so little torque that stoplights became endurance tests. If the light turned green and you needed to make a left before oncoming traffic approached, you simply waited for the next cycle. The Maverick wasn't going to risk its life for your convenience. Merging onto freeways became a spiritual experience. You had to pray, floor it, and hope the truck behind you had good brakes. Even then, you'd still hear the 170 screaming in protest, begging you not to push it past its comfort zone, which apparently was anything above a gentle idle. Fuel economy, worse than the ads suggested. Despite being painfully weak, the 170 i6 didn't deliver spectacular fuel savings. Owners expected Prius-like efficiency. What they got was mid-teens in city driving and low 20s on the highway, barely better than some V8s of the era. The engine had to work so hard to move the car that efficiency tanked, especially with an automatic transmission. In other words, the Maverick punished you with slowness and still made you pay for fuel. Impressive in a tragic way. The interior: poverty on wheels. The interior of a 1970 Maverick 170 i6 deserves its own chapter in the history of automotive cheapness. The dashboard looked like it had been chiseled from melted plastic toys. The knobs felt like they would snap off if you breathed too hard. The basic model didn't even come with a glove box door, a radio, armrests, carpeting. This wasn't minimalist design, this was cost-cutting with a machete. Even the door locks and window cranks felt fragile. Touching anything inside the car was a gamble. Would it function, or would it come off in your hand? Handling, only in the loosest definition of the word. The Maverick didn't exactly handle. It wandered, it floated, it leaned. It behaved like a toddler learning to walk, unsteady, unpredictable, and easily overwhelmed. The steering was vague on purpose, apparently, because the car had no intention of responding quickly to any command. The suspension swayed dramatically during turns, making even modest cornering feel like a dramatic Hollywood stunt. If you wanted to drive aggressively, the Maverick had a simple answer for you: don't. Why the Maverick sold anyway? Despite all of this, the Maverick with the 170 i6 sold extremely well. Why? Because it was cheap, easy to maintain, simple, endlessly available, and critically, had no real competition in its price class until the imports caught up. Ford wasn't selling quality, Ford was selling bare minimum mobility. And in 1970, Americans were eager buyers. But after a few years, many Mavericks ended up in junkyards, rusted away, blown apart by poor build quality, or simply abandoned. Survivors are rare today, not because they were special, but because they were disposable by design. Why enthusiasts avoid the 170 i6 like a plague? Today, nobody restoring a Maverick wants the 170 i6. Collectors avoid it. Hot rodders rip it out immediately. Even nostalgia fans admit it's the weakest, most depressing part of the car. The Maverick is remembered fondly, but the 170? It's remembered like a bad childhood haircut. Embarrassing, regrettable, and best forgotten. Conclusion: a cheap car that felt cheap every second. The 1970 Ford Maverick 170 inline-six wasn't just an economy car, it was a warning. It showed exactly what happens when a manufacturer builds something as cheaply as humanly possible and calls it modern. The car was weak, loud, unrefined, joyless, and built with cost-cutting as its only guiding principle. It offered nothing resembling excitement or personality. It was transportation in its most stripped-down, miserable form. A car powered by an engine with all the enthusiasm of a tired hamster. In short, the 1970 Maverick 170 i6 was the automotive equivalent of cardboard. Functional, but only barely. And never enjoyable.
Number 2. 1974 Plymouth Duster 360. Detuned. The muscle car that forgot its muscles. By 1974, the American muscle car was on life support. The glory days of high-compression V8s, wild camshafts, and tire-shredding performance were fading into a haze of federal regulations, rising insurance rates, and an oil crisis that made horsepower seem almost immoral. It was in this bleak environment that Plymouth attempted something bold, maybe even desperate. They took the lightweight, inexpensive Duster, dropped in a 360 cubic inch V8, and hoped the result would recapture the magic of the earlier 340 powered Screamers. Unfortunately, all the magic was gone. What remained was a car that looked the part but performed like a wheezing impersonation of its former self. On paper, a Duster 360 should have been a bright spot in the mid-70s melange. The Duster was compact, relatively light, and had a loyal following. Back in 1970 to 1973, it had offered some genuinely spirited performance, particularly in 340 trim. Mopar fans worshipped those early years. But by 1974, the world had changed drastically, and not in the Duster's favor. Federal emission standards strangled engines with air pumps, retarded timing, and restrictive catalytic converters. Insurance companies punished high-performance engines. Fuel shortages made buyers skittish, and the once mighty Chrysler Corporation was becoming notorious for declining build quality. So what did Plymouth do? They introduced the 360. At first glance, this seemed like a promising move. The 360 was a robust engine with plenty of displacement. Mopar enthusiasts knew that the 360, when unfettered, could be a genuinely strong performer. But that wasn't the engine that made it into the 1974 Duster. Instead, Plymouth fitted a version that had been watered down, declawed, and robbed of its spirit by emission controls. The result? Only 245 gross horsepower became a grim 220 gross, which translated to around 180 to 190 net horsepower at best. And that was being generous. Some examples rolled off the line producing far less. In a vacuum, 180 horsepower doesn't sound terrible. But in 1974, cars were gaining weight while engines lost muscle. The Duster 360 had to move roughly 3,300 pounds, plus the weight of its new emissions gear, safety bumpers, and soundproofing. The once lightweight Duster had become heavier and slower, and the engine no longer had the torque curve needed to provide the snappy, aggressive feel that its badge suggested. Acceleration figures proved it. 0 to 60 times often drifted into the 9-second range. Quarter-mile passes were nothing to brag about. The car no longer felt like a street brawler. Instead, it felt like an asthmatic former boxer trying to get back into shape. The real tragedy was the mismatch between appearance and performance. The Duster 360 still looked ready to fight. It had a bold stance, muscular lines, and optional graphics packages that screamed performance. Buyers could get hood scoops, bold stripes, raised white letter tires, everything that shouted, "I'm fast." But under the surface, the engine wheezed, the carburetor stumbled, and the exhaust note sounded more like someone clearing their throat than a proud V8. At stoplights, the car hesitated, coughed, or bogged down when asked to move with authority. Drivers expecting classic Mopar violence instead got mild irritation. Handling wasn't much of a saving grace either. The 360 engine added weight up front, and the chassis, designed originally for economy, was never meant to be a performance platform. Sloppy steering feel, uneven ride quality, and noticeable body roll resulted in a car that cornered with all the enthusiasm of a reluctant shopping cart. The brakes, still drums in many cases, faded under sustained use. Road testers often complained that the Duster 360 pretended to be a muscle car but had none of the athleticism required to back it up. Inside, the Duster 360 offered the typical mid-70s budget Chrysler experience. Plastic trim that cracked, vinyl seats that split, dashboards that warped, and assembly quality that varied wildly from car to car. Enthusiasts joked that the Duster's interior would fall apart before the engine ever would, and that wasn't far from the truth. By the time the car had a few years under its belt, rattles were standard equipment. The sound of loose trim pieces became the soundtrack of every highway drive. Yet, despite all its flaws, the Duster 360 holds an odd place in automotive history. It represents the attempt to keep American performance alive during a time when everything seemed stacked against it. Plymouth knew the golden age was dying, but they tried to keep the flame lit, even if it flickered weakly. The Duster 360 wasn't a hero. It was more of a survivor, a reminder of what once was and what could no longer be. A muscle car forced into early retirement by policies, economics, and shifting consumer priorities. And in a way, that's what makes the 1974 Plymouth Duster 360 so memorable. It stands as one of the clearest examples of the 1970s melange, a car designed with the heart of a performer but strangled until it gasped for air at every stoplight. It looked mean, but it drove mild. It carried the DNA of Mopar greatness, but suffered the fate of mid-decade emission strangulation. It wanted to be fast, desperately, but was born into an era where speed was no longer allowed. For enthusiasts today, the Duster 360 is both a cautionary tale and a canvas. Restorers can unlock the engine's true potential with modern tuning and parts, proving that the bones of the car were always capable of something better. But as it left the factory in 1974, it was undeniably a muscle car that forgot its muscle, a victim of its time wrapped in the styling of something far more exciting. And that's why it earns its place among the most disappointing muscle cars of the decade, a Mopar that had everything going for it except actual power.
Number 1. 1981 American Motors Concord, the luxury compact that never quite was. By 1981, American Motors Corporation was fighting for its life. The company had always been the underdog in Detroit. Smaller budgets, smaller factories, and a habit of stretching old platforms far beyond their expiration dates. The AMC Concord, introduced in 1978 and still stumbling along by 1981, was the embodiment of that philosophy. Take an aging design, dress it up, sell it as something new, and hope buyers won't notice the wrinkles. In the case of the 1981 Concord, AMC tried to sell it as a luxury compact. An ambitious idea on paper, but one that in reality translated into vinyl stuck onto the bones of the old Hornet, topped with questionable fit and finish and a lingering sense of déjà vu. To understand why the 1981 Concord felt so mismatched, you must look at its origins. The AMC Hornet, introduced in 1970, was a respectable no-frills compact car designed during an era of chrome bumpers and carbureted engines. By 1981, that same Hornet platform was more than a decade old, carrying the battle scars of countless facelifts, rebrandings, and recycled engineering. AMC was notorious for making do with what it had, and in the late 1970s, what it had was the Hornet chassis.
So, as the Malibu became more sophisticated and the Ford Fairmont ushered in downsized modernity, AMC doubled down on the one thing it could afford: appearance packages. The Concord was AMC's attempt to upscale the Hornet, transforming a basic economy car into something that could masquerade as a premium product. The 1981 model year tried especially hard to maintain this illusion even as the car's fundamentals betrayed its age. Price-conscious buyers in the early 80s liked the idea of a smaller luxury car, and AMC flocked to that niche. But luxury, as it turned out, meant mostly ornamentation. Padded vinyl roofs, plush-ish seats, and bright trim glued everywhere AMC could find space for it. The brochure called it refinement. Owners called it decoration. One of the most notorious aspects of the 1981 Concord was its fit and finish, or lack thereof. AMC, operating on a shoestring budget, simply didn't have the quality control of its larger rivals. Panel gaps varied from car to car. Trim pieces sometimes didn't line up. Interiors creaked even while parked. Wind noise seeped through door seals that seemed borrowed from a hardware store rather than engineered for a car. Reviewers of the era politely called it inconsistent build quality. Owners were less polite. They called it sloppy. Open the door of a 1981 Concord and the experience reinforced what critics already suspected. This was a Hornet trying very, very hard to look classy. The dashboard still carried the simple, plasticky design language of the early 1970s. The seats were comfortable enough, but lacked genuine support. The fake wood grain looked like it came from a discount furniture catalog. Even the upscale features like a digital clock, plush carpeting, or soft-touch materials felt tacked on rather than integrated. Luxury wasn't something you added with glue. It was something you engineered. AMC, unfortunately, didn't have the budget for engineering. Under the hood, the 1981 Concord didn't offer much to elevate its status. The base engine was AMC's elderly 2.5-liter inline-4, rough, noisy, and underpowered. Optional was the famous but equally ancient 4.2-liter inline-6, 258 cubic inch, an engine loved for its durability but not for refinement. Both engines were relics of a past era, built more for longevity than for smoothness. On a test drive, the Concord delivered the kind of soundscape you'd expect from a vehicle designed long before NVH, noise, vibration, harshness, was an industry priority. Acceleration was, generously, leisurely. Even with the inline-6, a 0 to 60 miles per hour time in the 13 to 15-second range wasn't uncommon. The four-cylinder versions were slower still, particularly when saddled with the optional automatic transmission that shifted with all the enthusiasm of a bored teenager. Fuel economy was acceptable for the time, but the driving experience felt outdated. Competing cars from GM, Ford, and especially the emerging Japanese brands felt more refined, more modern, and more cohesive. The ride quality, however, was strangely one of the Concord's few strengths. AMC's suspension tuning, left over from the Hornet and polished lightly through the years, gave the car a soft, floaty feel reminiscent of bigger American vehicles. The problem was that the Concord wasn't supposed to feel like a downsized Oldsmobile. It was meant to be a compact luxury car, but its handling remained vague and wallowy. Sharp turns produced body lean that could make passengers seasick. Steering feel was numb, offering no real communication from the road. The driving dynamics revealed the truth. This was a 1970s car in 1980s clothing. Despite all this, the 1981 American Motors Concord wasn't entirely without charm. There was a certain scrappy earnestness in AMC's approach. The company was trying to compete in a rapidly changing automotive world with a fraction of the resources of its rivals. The Concord was a symbol of that hustle, proof of what creativity and a lot of vinyl could accomplish when money was tight. It may not have been genuinely luxurious, but it was affordable. It may not have been modern, but it was durable. And for some buyers, particularly in rural areas or among older Americans, those qualities mattered more than sophistication. Still, history has judged the 1981 American Motors Concord as a car that never quite achieved what it set out to be. AMC wanted a premium compact rival to the likes of the Buick Skylark or Ford Granada. What it built instead was a dressed-up Hornet with limited refinement and an aging foundation. The styling updates couldn't mask its roots, the comfort features couldn't hide the shortcuts, and the luxury story couldn't distract from the mechanical reality. Today, the 1981 Concord is remembered as one of AMC's more curious attempts at survival, a car that tried to fake luxury in an era when true refinement was becoming more important. It stands as an example of how far a company will stretch when backed into a financial corner. It's a snapshot of a brand trying to stay afloat by reinventing the familiar, even if the end result felt more like a costume than a transformation. And that's why the 1981 Concord earns its place among the luxury compacts in name only. A car that promised more than it could deliver and revealed in every creak and every trim alignment the limits of a company running out of time.